In the dust-choked town of Redemption, a forgotten language, spoken only in glances, held the key to a man's life. They all saw a drunken old Navajo, a relic of a bygone era, stumbling his way to an early grave. But one man, a stranger haunted by his own silence, saw something else entirely in the old man's carefully orchestrated fall. He saw a desperate, silent scream. This is the story of how a single, unnoticed gesture unraveled a conspiracy of greed, so venomous it threatened to poison the very soul of the land and burn the town of Redemption to the ground. The sun over Redemption, Arizona, was a merciless hammer beating the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything and everyone. It coated the sweat-slicked brows of freight haulers, filmed the windows of Martha's Mercantile, and dulled the ambitious shine on the sign of the town's land office, which read, Jedediah Kane, Progress and Prosperity. To most, Jedediah Kane was redemption. He had arrived a decade prior with a fortune of mysterious origin, and had single-handedly dragged the sleepy settlement into the latter half of the 19th century. He'd financed the new church, built the schoolhouse, and owned the bank, the saloon, and the loyalty of nearly every man who drew a wage within the town limits. His face, framed by silvering hair and a meticulously trimmed beard, was a portrait of benevolent authority. He smiled easily, his voice a smooth baritone that could soothe a nervous investor or calm a brawling cowboy with equal effect. Into this tightly controlled world drifted Caleb Hayes. He was a man made of quiet angles and shadows, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that missed nothing and revealed less. He'd arrived 2 weeks ago, on a tired roan taking a room above the smithy and a job swamping out the saloon. Work that was beneath a man with his calloused hands, and the confident way he wore the Colt Peacemaker low on his hip. He spoke only when necessary, his words sparse and clipped, as if each one cost him something dear. The townsfolk, accustomed to the boisterous swagger of prospectors and cowhands, quickly labelled him shy, perhaps simple, and left him to his mops and his silence. Caleb courted this anonymity. He was running not from the law, but from a memory of a high mountain pass, and a moment of hesitation that had cost a good man his life. The silence he now wrapped himself in was both a penance and a shield. In redemption, he hoped the ghosts of his past would finally be quieted by the sheer monotonous heat and dust. It was on a blistering Tuesday afternoon that he first truly noticed the old Navajo. The man whom the townsfolk called Hosteen was a fixture on the edge of their society. They saw him as a sad caricature, a remnant of a proud people now reduced to begging for whiskey with the few coins he earned selling trinkets. Today was no different. He staggered along the boardwalk, his steps a clumsy, uncoordinated dance, his voice a low, guttural slur that most mistook for a drunken song. A pair of young ranch hands, Silas and Jeb, who worked for Kane's sprawling K-Bar ranch, shoved him playfully. "Watch it, old-timer!" Silas jeered, his laughter sharp and cruel. "You'll spill that rot gut you're hiding." Hosteen stumbled, catching himself on a post outside the saloon. He mumbled something incoherent, his head lolling. Caleb, sweeping the dust from the saloon's batwing doors, paused. He watched as the old man's eyes, rheumy and seemingly unfocused, flickered for a fraction of a second. They weren't the dull, vacant eyes of a drunk. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a desperate, burning urgency. The glance was so fleeting, so utterly at odds with the shambling wreck of a man, that Caleb thought he must have imagined it. But he kept watching. The ranch hands grew bored and moved on, swaggering into the saloon for a drink. Hosteen remained propped against the post, his body swaying. As he pushed himself upright, his right hand gnarled and weathered, as old leather brushed against the rough wood of the post. He tapped it 3 times, a pause, then twice more. A simple, nervous, drunken gesture. Nothing more. Except it wasn't. Caleb felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. Years ago, as a scout for the army, he'd spent a winter with the Ute tribe. They had taught him fragments of the intricate, unspoken language of the plains, a universal tapestry of hand signs and gestures that could convey complex ideas across tribal lines. The taps were wrong for a simple fidget. They were deliberate, rhythmic. It was a distress signal, a call for a parley, an ancient sign for, "I have urgent news." Caleb's gaze narrowed. He looked from the old man back to the saloon where Silas and Jeb were now laughing with the bartender, their pay from Jedediah Kane clinking on the bar. He saw Deputy Miller making his rounds, his hand resting on his pistol, his eyes scanning the street with a practiced, complacent air. The entire town was a picture of sleepy, sun-baked normalcy. Yet here was this old man playing the part of a drunk while sending out a silent, desperate message that no one was equipped to see. He stumbled away from the post, his path taking him past the mercantile. He paused, pretending to fumble with the blanket roll on his back. His hand dipped inside, and for a moment Caleb saw him touch a small, intricately beaded pouch. Then his eyes lifted, sweeping across the landscape. They didn't linger on the town, but on the distant hazy line of mountains to the north, toward the lands the treaty had left to his people. His gaze then dropped just for a second to the large water trough in the center of the street, before finally, almost imperceptibly flicking towards the grand 2-story house at the end of town. Jedediah Kane's house. The entire sequence took less than 10 seconds. To anyone else, it was the aimless wandering of a man lost in a bottle. To Caleb, it was a sentence spoken in a language of shadows. "I have urgent news about the water from the mountains involving Kane." Caleb's hand tightened on his broom. A cold knot of dread formed in his stomach, a feeling he recognized all too well. It was the precursor to trouble, the kind of trouble he had ridden 1,000 miles to escape. He wanted to turn away, to retreat back into the dim, whiskey-scented anonymity of the saloon and forget what he had seen. Let the town handle its own problems. He was just a stranger, a ghost passing through. But as Hosteen finally shuffled around a corner and out of sight, Caleb couldn't shake the image of the old man's eyes, the brief, terrifying flash of clarity in a meticulously crafted disguise. It was a silent cry, and against his will, Caleb had heard it. The ghosts of his past were stirring, whispering a terrible familiar warning: inaction has a price, and it is always paid in blood. For 2 days, Caleb wrestled with himself. He scrubbed floors, polished glasses, and kept his head down, trying to convince himself that he had misinterpreted the signs. He was a man looking for trouble where there was none, projecting his own haunted past onto the sad decline of an old native. Redemption was peaceful, almost boringly so. Jedediah Kane was a philanthropist, the town's anchor. The idea that he was involved in some nefarious plot was absurd. Caleb told himself this 12 times a day, but the lie grew thinner with each repetition. He started watching. He observed the town not as a resident, but as a scout tracking a dangerous quarry. He saw how every significant business transaction seemed to involve Kane. He saw how Deputy Miller, while not a bad man, deferred to Kane with a readiness that went beyond simple respect for the town's benefactor. It bordered on fealty. And he saw Kane's 2 pet enforcers, Silas and Jeb, who didn't act like simple ranch hands. They moved with a swagger that wasn't earned from roping cattle, but from intimidating men. They were Kane's shadow, enforcing his will in the darker corners of town, where his polished reputation couldn't reach. On the 3rd day, His resolve broke. He saw Hosteen again, this time near the livery. The old man was sitting in the dust, leaning against a corral fence, a cheap bottle of whiskey in his hand. A group of children were taunting him from a safe distance. Hosteen seemed oblivious, taking a long, theatrical swig from the bottle. But Caleb, watching from the alley across the street, saw that the old man's lips barely touched the rim. Most of the liquor dribbled down his chin and onto his worn shirt. It was a performance, and a damn convincing one. Caleb waited. He waited until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The children grew tired of their game and scattered. The street emptied as families went inside for supper. Finally, Hosteen was alone. He slowly, painfully got to his feet, using the fence for support. He glanced around his eyes, sweeping the street, lingering for a moment on the darkened alley where Caleb stood hidden. It was an invitation. Caleb slipped from the shadows, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He circled around, approaching the livery from the back, moving with the practiced stealth of a predator. He found Hosteen waiting by the rear stables, away from prying eyes. The transformation was startling. The drunken slump was gone. The old man stood straighter, his shoulders back. The roomy, unfocused look in his eyes had been replaced by a razor-sharp intelligence. He was still an old man, weary and weathered by time, but the fool was gone. In his place stood a warrior. "You saw," Hosteen said. His voice was not the slurred mumble from the street, but a low, gravelly rasp, heavy with the accent of his people, but clear and precise. Caleb stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands in plain sight. "I saw a man playing a dangerous part." A flicker of relief crossed Hosteen's face. "Few here have eyes to see beyond what they are shown. They see a drunk Indian. It is an easy costume to wear. It makes me invisible." "What did you want me to see?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hosteen's gaze was intense. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He raised his left-hand palm facing Caleb. This was the old way, the language of the plains that transcended spoken words. He tapped his chest with his right index finger. "Me. My people." He then brought his cupped hand to his mouth in the universal sign for water, but then twisted his wrist, turning the hand over and flicking his fingers downward, a sign for bad or spoiled. He followed this by pointing a rigid finger at his own tongue and making a gagging motion. "Poison." His eyes locked with Caleb's, ensuring he understood. Then he swept his arm in a wide arc, pointing north towards the distant mountains, the source of Bitter Creek, the stream that fed the reservation lands. He held his point, then slowly, deliberately drew his hand back and pointed it directly at the center of town, towards the imposing silhouette of Jedediah Canaan's residence. The message was chillingly clear. "My people's water from the creek in the mountains is poisoned. Cain is responsible." Caleb's blood ran cold. It was one thing to suspect another, to have it confirmed. Poisoning a water source was not just an act of cruelty. It was an act of war, a quiet, insidious genocide. "Why?" Caleb asked, the single word hanging in the air between them. Why would he do this? Hosteen's face was a mask of grim certainty. He made the sign for land a flat motion with his hands, and then the sign for money, rubbing his thumb against his forefinger. He then made a sign Caleb didn't immediately recognize, clenching his fist, and then quickly opening it, a motion like something glittering. He repeated it. Silver. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed. Rumors of a silver strike in the foothills had been circulating for months, dismissed by most as wishful thinking. But if the rumors were true, and the vein ran under the reservation land, Cain couldn't simply take the land. It was protected by treaty, however flimsy. But if the people who lived there were to get sick to die off, or to be forced to abandon their homes in search of clean water, the land would be considered vacant, abandoned. Cain could then swoop in, claiming it was for the public good, for progress and prosperity. "He is killing your people to steal your land." Caleb stated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. Hosteen nodded slowly. "He is patient, a snake in the sun. He makes the people sick slowly. They think it is a curse from the spirits. The children weaken, the elders fade. Soon we will have to leave, or we will all be dust. I came for help, but the lawman wears Cain's brand." He looked at Caleb, his eyes pleading. "I have tried to tell others. They do not listen. But you saw the signs. You speak the language of the shadows. Will you listen?" The question was a weight, heavy and familiar. It was the same question that had echoed in the silence of that mountain pass all those years ago. A plea for help he had been too slow to answer. He looked at the old man, at the quiet dignity and desperate courage it took to play the fool while his people were dying. He thought of Jedediah Cain, with his smooth smile and his iron grip on the town. To stand against him was to stand against redemption itself. It was madness. It was suicide. Caleb thought of the long ride here, of the peace he had so desperately sought. He knew with a sinking certainty that he would not find it by turning his back. The ghosts would only grow louder. "Tell me everything," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. "Show me where to look." Caleb knew that approaching the law was a long shot, but it was a step he had to take. To act alone would make him a vigilante, a drifter taking the law into his own hands. If he was to have any hope of succeeding, he needed a sliver of legitimacy, a witness to his attempts to do things the right way. The only law in redemption, aside from Cain's private army of ranch hands, was Deputy Raymond Miller. Miller was a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered and weary. He had come to redemption with dreams of being a sheriff, of building a respectable career. But years in the town's stagnant heat, under the long shadow of Jedediah Cain, had baked the ambition out of him. He kept the peace, which mostly meant arresting the occasional drunk and breaking up fights in the saloon. He was competent, not corrupt, but he was a man who had long ago learned which way the wind blew, and in redemption it always blew from the direction of the K-Bar Ranch. Caleb found him in the small, stuffy sheriff's office the next morning. A wanted poster for some long-gone outlaw was tacked crookedly on the wall, its edges yellowed and curled. Miller was at his desk, painstakingly writing a report, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as Caleb entered, his expression shifting from focus to mild annoyance. "Hayes," he said, setting down his pen. "Don't tell me there's been another brawl at the saloon already. The sun's barely up." "No, Deputy. I need to talk to you about something else." "Something serious," Caleb said, his voice even. He remained standing by the door, keeping his posture non-threatening. Miller leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "Serious, what's on your mind?" "It's about Hosteen," Caleb began. A dismissive sigh escaped Miller's lips. "Let me guess. He's been bothering folks down at the Mercantile again. Martha's complained before. I'll have a word with him. Tell him to take his drinking elsewhere." "He's not drunk," Caleb said quietly. "It's an act." Miller stared at him for a long moment, then let out a short, humorless laugh. "An act, Hayes, I've seen that man so deep in his cups he couldn't find the ground with both hands. What is this, some kind of joke?" "He's trying to warn someone," Caleb pressed, ignoring the deputy's skepticism. "He believes the water on the reservation, the water from Bitter Creek, is being poisoned." The amusement vanished from Miller's face, replaced by a hard, wary look. Poisoned by who, for what reason? Caleb took a breath. This was the moment of truth. He believes Jedediah Kane is behind it, to drive his people off the land so Kane can get to the silver that's rumored to be there. The air in the small office became thick and heavy. Miller's hand, which had been resting on his desk, slowly moved to his side, closer to the worn leather of his gun belt. His eyes, which had been merely dismissive, were now cold and hostile. "You need to be careful what you say, Hayes," Miller said, his voice dangerously low. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work. Jedediah Kane is the man who built this town. He employs half the people in it, myself included. He's a good man. To suggest he'd be capable of what you're suggesting, that's not just foolish, it's slander. I'm just telling you what I was told. What I saw," Caleb insisted. "The old man is terrified. His people are getting sick. All I'm asking is that you ride out there. Look at the creek. Talk to the people. See for yourself." "Talk to who? A bunch of superstitious natives who think they're cursed and take the word of their town drunk over the word of Mr. Kane." Miller stood up his height, giving him a clear advantage in the small room. He was a wall of indignant authority. "You come into my town a man with no name and no past, and within a few weeks you're spinning these wild, poisonous tales. It sounds to me like you're the one trying to stir up trouble." "I'm trying to stop it," Caleb countered, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to control it. "A sick child doesn't care about a man's reputation." "Dead is dead, Deputy. And a lie is a lie." Miller shot back, his face reddening. "Let me give you some advice, swamp jockey. You keep your nose in the saloon spittoons where it belongs. You stop bothering me with these fantasies, and you stay the hell away from Hosteen. I don't know what kind of game you two are playing, but it ends now. If I hear you've been spreading this filth around town, I'll have you in this cell for vagrancy and incitement, so fast your head will spin." He pointed a thick finger at the door. "Now get out of my office." Caleb held the deputy's gaze. He saw no malice in Miller's eyes, only a profound, stubborn blindness. Miller wasn't a bad man, but he was a captured man, chained by loyalty and the comfort of the status quo. He genuinely could not conceive of a world where Jedediah Kane, the town's great benefactor, was a monster. To even consider it would mean his entire world, his entire career was built on a lie. It was easier to believe Caleb was a liar and Hosteen was a drunk. Without another word, Caleb turned and walked out the hot sun, hitting him like a physical blow. The door to the law was closed. Hosteen had been right. The lawman wore Kane's brand. He was completely and utterly on his own. As he walked down the street, he felt eyes on his back. He glanced over his shoulder. Deputy Miller was standing in the doorway of his office, watching him. But Miller wasn't the only one. Across the street, leaning against an awning, were Silas and Jeb. They weren't laughing now. They were watching Caleb with a cold, predatory stillness. His visit to the sheriff's office hadn't gone unnoticed. He was no longer an anonymous drifter. He was a target. The confrontation with Deputy Miller and the subsequent menacing stares from Kane's men sent a chill through Caleb that had nothing to do with the desert heat. He was exposed. The comfortable cloak of anonymity he had worn for so long had been ripped away, leaving him feeling raw and vulnerable. He retreated to his small hot room, above the smithy, the rhythmic clang of the hammer, below a counterpoint to the racing of his own heart. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, his head in his hands, the ghosts he'd tried so hard to outrun crowding in around him. They whispered of failure, of cold and snow, and the sharp final crack of a rifle. They took him back 5 years to the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies. He hadn't been Caleb Hayes then. He'd been Corporal Samuel Jones of the United States Army, a scout renowned for his tracking skills and his uncanny ability to read the land. He was partnered with a seasoned sergeant named Marcus Thorne, a man with a booming laugh and a family waiting for him back in Denver. They were tasked with charting a new, safer passage through the treacherous mountains for a supply train. For weeks they'd navigated the unforgiving terrain. Marcus was the voice of the duo, full of stories and plans for the future, while Samuel was the eyes quiet and observant. One frozen afternoon, while tracking a stream, Samuel found something that made him pause, a single oddly shaped stone placed on a larger boulder. It was almost a natural formation easily missed, but he had spent time with the Ute and he recognized it as a warning sign. It meant hostile territory, or turn back. He mentioned it to Marcus. The sergeant, tired and eager to finish the mission, clapped him on the shoulder. "Just a rock, Sam," he'd laughed. "You're seeing shadows in every corner. We're almost through. Let's push on to the next ridge before we make camp." Samuel hesitated. His gut, the instinct that had kept him alive for years, was screaming at him. He should have insisted. He should have put his foot down, forced them to backtrack or take cover. But he was young, a corporal, arguing with a veteran sergeant. He doubted himself. He let Marcus's confidence override his own intuition. He had remained silent. They pushed on. The ambush came less than a mile later. It was swift, brutal, and utterly silent, save for the single shot that echoed through the pass. A small band of renegades, not interested in supplies, but in the army's rifles and horses. The bullet caught Marcus high in the chest. He was dead before he hit the snow-covered ground, his last expression one of profound surprise. Samuel had survived a fortuitous dive behind a rock, saving him. He'd fought back with a cold, desperate fury, but the damage was done. When the fighting was over, he knelt beside Marcus in the snow, the sergeant's boisterous laughter replaced by an eternal, deafening silence. In that moment, Samuel Jones died too. He carried Marcus's body back to the fort, resigned his commission, and started drifting. He took a new name, Caleb Hayes, and vowed to never again be responsible for anyone but himself. He had cultivated silence as a shield, believing that if he never spoke up, never got involved, he could never again be the cause of someone else's downfall. Now, sitting in the sweltering room in Redemption, the memory was as sharp and painful as if it had happened yesterday. He saw Hostine's face, the desperate plea in his eyes. He heard Deputy Miller's dismissive words. He saw Marcus Thorne's face, frozen in the Colorado snow. The situations were different, but the core choice was terrifyingly the same. See the warning sign and act, or dismiss it, and live with the consequences. His silence had killed Marcus. Would his silence now condemn Hostine and his people to a slow, agonizing death? A wave of self-loathing washed over him. He had run for 5 years, but he hadn't escaped anything. He had only carried his prison with him. Redemption. The town's name was a bitter irony. Perhaps it wasn't a place to hide, but a place to finally face the man he had become. He stood up, his movements stiff. The decision was made not with a surge of heroic courage, but with the grim resignation of a man who knew he had no other choice if he ever wanted to look at himself in the mirror again. He could not bring Marcus back, but he could honor his memory by not repeating the same mistake. He would not hesitate. He would not stay silent. He strapped on his gun belt, checking the action of the Colt Peacemaker. The familiar weight was comforting, a solid piece of reality in a world of shadows and lies. He was no longer just a swamp jockey. He was a scout once more. Hostine had given him the map, the water, the mountain's cane. It was time to follow the trail. He moved to the small, grimy window and looked out. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the dusty street. He saw Silas and Jeb emerge from the saloon, mounting their horses. They weren't riding back towards the K-Bar ranch. They were riding north in the direction of Bitter Creek. They weren't just watching him anymore. They were guarding something. Caleb knew with chilling certainty what he had to do. He couldn't go bursting in a lone man against Kane's operation. He needed proof. Hard, undeniable proof that would force even a skeptic, like Deputy Miller, to open his eyes. And that proof was waiting for him up in the hills in the poisoned waters of a dying creek. He would have to move under the cover of darkness and pray he was as quiet as the ghosts that drove him. Night fell on the desert like a black velvet shroud, thick and starless. A sliver of a moon offered little light which suited Caleb just fine. He slipped out of the smithy, moving through the back alleys of redemption, like a wraith. He had traded his tired roan for a Rongier dark-coated Mustang, at the livery a horse bred for endurance and quiet footing. He avoided the main road instead, cutting north across the open scrubland, the horse's hooves making only soft thuds in the sandy soil. Hosteen had been clear. Follow the low ridge that ran parallel to the main trail, and it would lead to the headwaters of Bitter Creek, the spot where the stream emerged from the mountains before meandering down towards the reservation. It was a 2-hour ride, and every rustle in the sagebrush, every cry of a distant coyote sent a jolt of adrenaline through Caleb's veins. He was back in familiar territory, a lone scout in hostile country, his senses alive and tingling. He tethered the Mustang in a small hidden arroyo a 1/4 mile from the creek and proceeded on foot, his colt drawn. The air grew cooler as he gained elevation. Soon he could hear the gentle murmur of running water. It should have been a soothing sound in the arid landscape, but it filled him with a sense of foreboding. Caleb crested a small rise and looked down. Bitter Creek was just below, gurgling over smooth stones in the pale moonlight. It looked clean, pure. He made his way down the embankment, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He reached the water's edge and knelt, the smell hitting him first. It wasn't the clean, earthy scent of a mountain stream. There was a faint, sharp chemical odor underneath, like bitter almonds and rust. He followed the bank upstream. After about 50 yards, he found the first sign of sickness. A small trout, its silver belly upturned, was snagged against a rock. A few feet further, another. Then he saw them, a dozen or more, dead and dying, trapped in a small eddy. This was no natural blight. His eyes swept the area again, this time looking for human signs. He found them near a thicket of willows, fresh hoof prints, 2 horses shod, in a way that matched the horses Silas and Jeb had been riding. And near the prints the ground was dark and stained, the vegetation withered, and black as if something corrosive had been spilled there repeatedly. This was the spot. They were dumping the poison directly into the creek head. He found what he was looking for, half buried under a pile of loose rocks, a heavy canvas sack. It was still damp. He untied the top, and a wave of the acrid smell washed over him. Inside was a dark, crystalline powder. He didn't know what it was, arsenic cyanide, some industrial mining byproduct. But he knew it was poison. He had his proof. He retied the sack, slinging it over his shoulder. He needed to get a sample of this back to town. As he stood up, a twig snapped behind him. Caleb dove sideways without a second's thought, the muscle memory of 100 ambushes taking over. The night exploded with the roar of a shotgun blast. Buckshot tore through the air where his chest had just been shredding the willow leaves behind him. He landed hard in the shallow water, the icy shock momentarily stealing his breath. "Figured you'd come sniffing around, swamp jockey." Silas's voice boomed from the darkness on the ridge. Another shot, this one from a rifle, kicked up dirt near Caleb's head. Jeb. They had been waiting for him. His visit to the deputy had been a fatal mistake, a signal to Cain that he knew too much. Caleb scrambled behind a large boulder, the canvas sack still clutched in his hand. The Colt was heavy and steady in his other. He was pinned down, two of them with the high ground, a classic deadly trap. "Give it up, Hayes!" Jeb shouted, his voice closer now, off to the left. They were flanking him. "Mr. Cain just wants to talk to you. Make it easy on yourself." Caleb knew what kind of talk Cain had in mind, the kind that ended with a body buried in an unmarked grave. He had to move. Staying put was a death sentence. He took a desperate gamble. He ripped a piece of cloth from his shirt, wrapped it around a small rock from the creek bed, and tossed it downstream into a patch of dense brush. As it landed with a loud rustle, both Silas and Jeb fired in its direction. In that split second of distraction, Caleb bolted. He broke cover running upstream, using the creek and the line of boulders for cover. He was a fleeting shadow in the moonlight. A rifle cracked again, and a searing pain exploded in his left shoulder. He cried out, stumbling, but forced himself to keep moving. The impact had spun him around, but the bullet had gone clean through the muscle. It was agonizing, but not fatal. Not yet. He half ran, half stumbled through the darkness, the sounds of his pursuers crashing through the undergrowth behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood soaking his shirt. The sack of poison felt like it weighed a ton. He had to get back to his horse. He burst into the arroyo where the Mustang was hidden. The horse shied nervously at the smell of his blood. With a surge of adrenaline, Caleb fumbled with the reins with his good hand, hauling himself into the saddle. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and the animal leaped forward, charging out of the arroyo and into the open desert. Two more shots rang out behind him, but they were wild, swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. He was away. He risked a glance back and saw the two figures standing on the ridge, small silhouettes against the moonlit sky. They wouldn't follow. They knew the desert at night was a treacherous place, and he had a significant head start. Leaning low over the horse's neck, Caleb raced through the darkness, the rhythmic pounding of hooves, a drumbeat of survival. He was hurt, a hunted man with a sack of poison as his only evidence. He had his proof, but it had cost him dearly. Returning to redemption was impossible. Miller would arrest him, and Cain's men would kill him in his cell. He needed an ally. Someone inside the town, someone respected, someone who had as much to lose from Cain's corruption as anyone else. His vision started to blur from the pain and blood loss. One face swam into focus in his mind, a pragmatic, no-nonsense woman who saw the comings and goings of everyone in town. A woman who had once commented on the strange, heavy crates being delivered to the K-Bar ranch at night. Martha, the owner of the mercantile. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only one he had left. Caleb circled wide around Redemption, approaching from the south, where the town petered out into scattered homesteads. He slid from the saddle behind the mercantile, his body screaming in protest. The pain in his shoulder was a hot, throbbing fire, and his shirt was stiff with drying blood. He was lightheaded, his strength failing fast. Martha's mercantile was dark, a solid, respectable building with living quarters on the second floor. A faint light shone from an upstairs window. Taking a deep, ragged breath, Caleb picked up a handful of pebbles and tossed them against the glass. He waited. Nothing. He threw another handful harder this time. The window slid open with a squeak. Martha's head appeared, her hair in a long braid over her shoulder. She was holding an old Spencer rifle. "Who's out there?" She called out, her voice sharp with suspicion. Not fear. "Show yourself, or I'll put a hole in you." "Martha, it's Caleb Hayes," he rasped, stepping out from the shadows of the loading dock. "I need your help. I'm hurt." He saw her lean forward, her eyes narrowing to better see him in the gloom. He saw the glint of the rifle barrel, then her sharp intake of breath as she took in his blood-soaked appearance. For a long moment she was silent. Caleb's heart pounded. If she turned him away, it was over. "Get in the back," she said, finally, her voice low and urgent. "The cellar door. And be quiet." The window slid shut. A minute later, Caleb heard a bolt being drawn, and the heavy cellar door creaked open. Martha stood there holding a lantern, the rifle still in her hand. Her face, usually set in a stern, businesslike expression, was etched with alarm. She looked at his shoulder at the sack in his good hand, and then at his pale, sweat-sheened face. "Get in quickly," she ordered. She led him down into the cool, dark cellar, which smelled of burlap-dried apples and earth. She bolted the door behind them and set the lantern on a crate. "What in God's name happened to you, Caleb?" she asked, her eyes assessing his wound with a practiced eye. "The whole town's in a stir. Deputy Miller was asking about you, said you'd made some wild accusations against Mr. Kane." "They're not wild," Caleb gritted out, slumping against a support beam. "And they're not accusations." He dropped the heavy canvas sack on the floor. It landed with a dull thud. "They're the truth. That's from Kane's men. They're dumping it into Bitter Creek." Martha knelt and cautiously opened the sack. The chemical smell contained, until now filled the small space. She recoiled, her face paling. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "What is it?" "Poison," Caleb said simply, "for the Navajo, to get their land." Martha stood up, her mind clearly working fast. She was a shrewd woman who had built her business from nothing. She was a pillar of the town, but she was no fool. She had seen the subtle shifts in power, the fear that Kane inspired masquerading as respect. "The crates," she said almost to herself. For months now, Kane's been getting shipments. Heavy crates delivered at night, not through the regular freight office. The manifests just said, "mining supplies." I thought it was odd. Her eyes met Caleb's, and in them he saw the dawning of a terrible understanding. The lie she had been living with, the lie the whole town had been living with, was cracking open. "They shot me, Martha, Silas and Jeb. They were waiting for me at the creek. If I go to Miller, I'm a dead man." He swayed the cellar, beginning to spin. "I need help." Her pragmatism took over. "First we deal with that shoulder." For the next hour, Martha proved to be as skilled a field medic as any army surgeon. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, the pain so intense that Caleb nearly blacked out. She probed for fragments of cloth, then stitched the entry and exit wounds with a needle and thread from her sewing kit, her movements quick and efficient. She bandaged it tightly with clean strips of linen. The whole time she asked questions, her voice low and steady. Caleb told her everything about Hostine's silent messages, the confrontation with Miller, the proof at the creek. When she was done, she gave him a healthy swig of the whiskey and sat back on a crate, the lantern light casting deep shadows on her face. "So Kane is not a savior," she said flatly. "He's a murderer, and Miller is either a fool or a coward." "He's a man who can't see what's right in front of him," Caleb corrected. "He believes in Kane." "Beliefs can be changed," Martha said, her jaw set in a hard line. "But not by a wanted man with a bullet in his shoulder. You can't show your face. They'll be hunting for you come sunrise. You'll stay down here." She stood and began to pace the small cellar. "A direct confrontation is suicide. Kane controls the law, and he has the guns. We can't fight him head-on. We have to expose him. Not just to Miller, but to the entire town all at once. We need to turn his greatest strength his reputation, against him. "How?" Caleb asked, his voice weak. Martha stopped pacing, a determined glint in her eye. "Cain is holding a town meeting in 2 days, at the church. He's going to formally announce his generous offer to buy the abandoned reservation lands for a pittance to be used for town expansion. He wants the public's blessing. He wants to look like a hero while he does it." She looked from Caleb to the sack of poison, and a plan began to form on her face. "He's giving us the stage. We need to make sure the right actors are on it when the curtain rises." She looked at Caleb. "You have the proof. Host-in is the witness. I am the respected citizen. It's a start." A grim smile touched her lips. "Jedediah Cain wants to put on a show for the town of redemption. Well, let's give them a show they'll never forget." In the cool, dark cellar, surrounded by the mundane inventory of a frontier store, a desperate alliance was forged. A wounded drifter, a shrewd shopkeeper, and an old Navajo man against the most powerful figure in the territory. The odds were impossible. But for the first time since riding into redemption, Caleb Hayes was not alone. The church bell tolled at noon its solemn clang, calling the citizens of redemption not to worship, but to a town meeting. The air was thick with anticipation. Jedediah Cain stood at a lectern placed before the altar, looking every bit the part of the town patriarch. He was dressed in a fine black suit, his silver hair immaculate, his expression one of grave benevolence. The church was packed. The townsfolk sat in the pews, fanning themselves in the stifling heat, their faces turned up to him in admiration. Deputy Miller stood by the door, a symbol of the law's endorsement. Silas and Jeb stood near the front, their arms crossed their presence, a subtle reminder of Cain's authority. "My friends, my neighbors." Cain began, his baritone voice filling the sacred space. "I have called you here today to discuss the future. Our future. For too long, the barren stretch of land to our north has lain fallow, a place of sickness and sorrow for the few natives who remain there. It is a land that has been cursed." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Providence has seen fit to drive them away. They are leaving, seeking healthier lands. And so an opportunity presents itself. An opportunity to expand, to grow, to secure prosperity for our children. I have filed a claim and propose to purchase this abandoned territory on behalf of the town. We will find its resources. We will build new homes. And redemption will become a beacon of progress in this great territory." A wave of applause filled the church. It was a perfect speech, preying on their hopes and their casual prejudice. Cain smiled, holding up a hand for silence. "It is with a heavy heart that we see our native neighbors depart," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "But it is God's will." "It is not God's will," a voice declared clear and strong from the back of the church. "It is yours." Every head turned. The crowd gasped. Standing in the center aisle was Martha, her face pale but resolute, and beside her stood Caleb Hayes, his left arm in a sling, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Cain's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Martha, Mr. Hayes, I believe this is a private town meeting. And you, Hayes, I hear the deputy has questions for you." Deputy Miller started forward, his hand on his gun. "Hayes, you're under arrest for what, deputy?" Caleb's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "For surviving an ambush by your employer's thugs." He looked directly at Cain. "You didn't just want to talk, did you, Jedediah?" Silas and Jeb tensed their hands, dropping to their pistols. Cain held up a calming hand, his composure returning. "This is absurd. The man is clearly delirious. He's a known troublemaker." "Am I?" Caleb challenged, taking a step forward. Or am I just the only one who listened when a good man tried to sound a warning? On cue, the church doors opened again. Hosteen walked in. But this was not the shuffling drunk the town knew. He was dressed in clean, dignified attire. He stood tall, his back straight, his eyes clear and sharp. The air of a wise elder replaced the facade of a broken man. The silence in the church was absolute. "My people are not leaving," Hosteen said, his voice resonating with an authority no one had ever heard from him. "We are being murdered." Lies. Cain roared, his mask of civility finally cracking. These are the desperate words of a vagrant, a drunk, and a bitter old man. "Then this must be a lie too," Martha said. She held up a clear glass jar filled with water from the church's own font. Then from a satchel, she produced the canvas sack Caleb had brought back. With a steady hand, she opened it and poured a small amount of the dark powder into the jar. The reaction was immediate and horrifying. The clear water fizzed and turned a sickly, cloudy yellow, an oily sheen rising to the surface. A collective gasp of horror swept through the pews. People who had drunk from Bitter Creek on hunting trips, who had let their livestock drink from it downstream, stared at the jar in terror. "This is the blessing Jedediah Cain has been giving the land." Caleb announced, his voice ringing with conviction. "He has been poisoning Bitter Creek for months, making the men, women, and children of Hosteen's tribe sick, so he could steal their land and the silver beneath it. He's a liar," Silas yelled, drawing his pistol. "He shot at us first." But it was too late. The proof was in the jar. The sight of the proud, sober Hosteen, the wound on Caleb's shoulder. The pieces were connecting in the minds of the townsfolk. They looked from the poisoned water to the face of the man they had trusted, and for the first time they saw the predator beneath the philanthropist. Deputy Miller stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. He looked at Cain, then at the jar, then at Caleb. The world he had known, the simple lines of right and wrong had dissolved. Cain saw his power evaporating. "Fools, he's trying to turn you against me. Seize them!" he screamed at Silas and Jeb. As the two thugs raised their guns, a shot exploded in the enclosed space. It wasn't from Caleb, it was from Deputy Miller. His bullet struck the wooden floor at Silas's feet. "No more," Miller said, his voice shaking, but firm, his pistol now aimed squarely at Cain's men. "This ends here. Drop your guns." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Silas, seeing the hardened resolve in Miller's eyes and the sea of hostile faces in the pews, slowly placed his gun on the floor. Jeb followed suit. Cain stared, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. His empire, built on lies and poison, had crumbled in minutes. He was no longer a benefactor. He was a monster exposed in the house of God. He lunged not for a gun, but for the side door, a desperate attempt to escape. But Caleb was faster. He moved to intercept his good arm, shooting out and grabbing Cain's suit jacket. Cain spun his face a snarl and swung a wild punch. Caleb ducked under it, the movement aggravating his wound, but his purpose was clear. He didn't strike back. He simply held on, a solid, immovable object, until Deputy Miller arrived, his pistol pressed firmly into Cain's back. "Jedediah Cain." Miller said the words, tasting strange and new in his mouth. "You are under arrest for attempted murder, and for the murder of—" He trailed off, looking at Hosteen, realizing the full scope of the atrocity. The reckoning had come. The silence had been broken, and its echo would reshape redemption forever. Caleb stood in the aisle of the church, the pain in his shoulder, a dull throb. But the weight on his soul, the ghost of a snowy mountain pass, was finally mercifully beginning to lift. He had not hesitated. He had listened to the silent cry, and in doing so, he had found his own voice, and perhaps even his own redemption. The story of redemption and the shy stranger is a stark reminder that courage isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about having the wisdom to listen to the quietest ones. It teaches us that true evil often wears a mask of respectability, and it can only be unmasked when good people refuse to look away. Caleb Hayes and Hostine showed us that a forgotten language and an open heart can be more powerful than a tyrant's entire arsenal. Their alliance, born of desperation, saved a community, and reminds us that sometimes the most heroic act is simply to see another person's silent suffering and choose to act. If this story of quiet courage and a town's dramatic reckoning resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a tale where the underdog finds their voice. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories from the untamed heart of the Old West. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.